August 16, 1966, 9:53 in the morning. Somewhere over the scorched plains of northern Iraq, an Air Force pilot named Munir Redfa pushes his throttle forward and makes a decision that will detonate through the entire balance of power in the Middle East. He is flying one of the most feared aircraft on Earth, a Soviet-built MiG-21, Mach 2 capable, a jet so secret, so tightly guarded, that Western intelligence agencies have never gotten within 100 feet of one. In 11 minutes, he is supposed to be flying a routine patrol near the Jordanian border. Instead, he kills his transponder, cuts radio contact, and turns due south, directly toward the one country his own government has sworn to erase from the map, Israel. Within minutes, Israeli air defense radar picks up an unidentified aircraft screaming across the border at full throttle, with zero warning and zero explanation. Fighter jets are already scrambling, anti-aircraft batteries are locking on. Everyone in that control room has the exact same thought. This is the opening move of a war. What none of them know, what almost no one on Earth knows, is that this attack has been 3 years in the making, built not with tanks or bombers, but with a woman's photograph, a forged bank account, and a lie so perfectly engineered that a man was about to betray his own country and hand the West its greatest intelligence prize of the Cold War. This is the story of Operation Diamond, how Israel's Mossad turned a single disillusioned pilot into the key that unlocked the Soviet Union's most guarded military secret, and how that secret would go on to save countless American lives just 1 year later, in the skies over Vietnam. It's a story about betrayal, about the terrifying gray zone between patriotism and survival, and about how the smallest human weaknesses, pride, fear, love, injustice, can be weaponized to bring down entire air forces. Because this isn't just a heist story, it's a story about how one aircraft, stolen not with force, but with psychology, quietly rewrote the outcome of wars its thieves would never even fight in. To understand why Israel was willing to gamble everything on stealing a single jet, you have to understand the nightmare sitting on its doorstep in the mid-1960s. By 1966, the Soviet Union had turned the Arab world into one of the most heavily armed regions on the planet. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, all three were being flooded with Soviet hardware, and at the center of that arsenal sat the MiG-21. It was, at the time, arguably the most advanced fighter jet in the world, faster than anything the Israeli Air Force had, more maneuverable, armed with heat-seeking missiles Western pilots had never even trained against. And that was the problem. Israeli pilots were being asked to fly into potential combat against a machine nobody in the West had ever flown, ever studied, ever even touched. They didn't know its top speed under combat load, its turning radius, its blind spots, its weaknesses. Israeli intelligence had photographs, grainy reconnaissance shots, second-hand reports from other nations' test pilots. But photographs don't tell you how a jet behaves at 40,000 feet with a live missile lock on your tail. Only flying it does. So, in the early 1960s, a small, obsessive unit inside Mossad began asking a question so audacious that most intelligence agencies would have dismissed it outright. What if we didn't just study the MiG-21? What if we simply took one, not shot down, not captured in war, flown, willingly, directly into Israeli territory by an enemy pilot who chose to defect? It sounds almost fantastical. Convince a trained military officer, embedded in a hostile air force, surrounded by loyalty oaths and secret police informants, to steal one of his own government's most valuable weapons, and defect to the very enemy he'd been trained since childhood to destroy. But Mossad had learned something crucial about the Arab air forces of the era. Loyalty on paper wasn't the same as loyalty in practice. Many of the pilots being trained on these advanced Soviet jets weren't fanatics. They were professionals, some resentful, some politically sidelined, some simply desperate for a way out of a system that saw them as expendable. All they needed was to find the right one. Israel's first real attempt didn't happen in Iraq, it happened in Egypt. Mossad agents spent months quietly cultivating contact with an Egyptian Air Force pilot they believed was disillusioned enough to flip. They offered money. They offered a new identity, a new life in the West. For a while, it seemed to be working. And then, silence. The pilot vanished from contact. Weeks later, word filtered back through Mossad's network. He'd been arrested. Egyptian counterintelligence had been watching the whole time. What happened to him afterward was never confirmed publicly. But inside Mossad, the message was clear. Egypt's internal security services were too good, too paranoid, too deeply embedded. This front was closed. It was a brutal lesson in a business where failure doesn't just mean disappointment, it can mean a man's life. A second attempt, this time aimed at a Syrian pilot, collapsed just as fast, undone by the same problem. These regimes had learned to watch their own aviators like hawks. Any pilot who so much as glanced too long at a foreigner could find himself under suspicion. 2 failed operations, 2 dead ends, and every month that passed, the strategic gap between Israeli and Arab air power kept widening. The MiG-21 squadrons kept growing. The clock, quite literally, was ticking toward the next war, so Mossad changed its entire approach. Instead of hunting for pilots inside the most tightly surveilled nations first, they went looking somewhere the paranoia hadn't fully calcified yet. Somewhere internal politics had already planted the seeds of resentment for them. Iraq, because Iraq had a fault line that Egypt and Syria didn't, one that Mossad's analysts had been quietly watching for years. And it wasn't political, it was something far older and far more dangerous to ignore: ethnic and religious discrimination inside the Iraqi military itself. Iraq's Air Force, like much of its officer corps, was dominated by Sunni Muslim Arabs loyal to the ruling Ba'ath government, but scattered within its ranks were minorities, Kurds, and Christians, men who had proven themselves in the cockpit, but who all understood, quietly, that they would never rise as high, or be trusted as fully, as their Sunni counterparts. Mossad's analysts began combing through every scrap of intelligence they had, looking for exactly one man, skilled enough to be trusted with Iraq's newest fighter jet, but alienated enough to want to burn it all down. They found him in 1963. His name was Munir Redfa. Munir Redfa was, by every professional measure, one of the finest pilots in the Iraqi Air Force. A Christian in an overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim officer corps, he had clawed his way to becoming a squadron commander, a rank that should have opened every door in the military. Instead, it exposed him to a slow, grinding humiliation. Promotions he'd earned went to less qualified Sunni officers. Assignments of prestige quietly passed him by. And in 1966, that humiliation turned into something far darker. Iraq's government ordered airstrikes against Kurdish villages in the country's north, part of a brutal campaign to crush a Kurdish uprising, and Redfa, along with other pilots, was ordered into the cockpit to fly those missions. For a man already treated as an outsider by his own chain of command, being forced to bomb civilian communities became the breaking point. According to later accounts, Redfa grew increasingly disturbed by what he was being asked to do, and increasingly convinced that he had no future and no honor left to protect inside the regime he served. He began looking, quietly, carefully, for a way out, and somewhere in Europe, on a personal trip abroad, that search intersected with a woman who was not who she claimed to be. Mossad's approach to Redfa wasn't a single dramatic pitch. It was a slow, patient siege, built over roughly 3 years, using multiple agents operating under deep cover, some posing as European business people, at least one using romantic connection as a means of building trust and gathering intelligence on his state of mind. They didn't lead with money, and they didn't lead with ideology. They led with empathy, validating his grievances, listening to his frustrations about the bombing campaigns, and slowly, carefully, floating the idea that there was a way out that could also mean something, a way to strike back against the government that had humiliated him, while saving himself and his family in the process. Eventually, the offer became concrete: defect, and bring the jet with you. In exchange, Israel would guarantee not just his safety, but the safety of his family, along with a substantial financial payment and a new life in the West. It was an almost impossible ask. Redfa wasn't just being asked to defect, he was being asked to defect in the one way that made escape nearly impossible, by stealing the very aircraft that Iraqi air defense would scramble everything to shoot down the moment it left formation. And there was a second problem, arguably even harder to solve than the flight itself. How do you get a man's entire family safely out of a police state before he steals a fighter jet, without tipping off the very intelligence services watching his every move? Mossad orchestrated a quiet, staggered extraction. Over weeks, Redfa's wife and children were maneuvered out of Iraq under false pretenses. A family vacation, a medical visit, a series of small, unremarkable lies designed to raise zero suspicion, one relative at a time. By the second week of August 1966, Redfa's family was safely out of the country. Now, it was just him and the jet. Everything Mossad had built for 3 years came down to a single 11-minute flight. August 16, 1966, Redfa reports for a scheduled training flight. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise a single eyebrow. Just another patrol near the Jordanian frontier, a route he'd flown dozens of times before. Except this time, Tucked into his flight suit, he carries nothing that could betray what's coming. No note, no goodbye. Just a plan memorized so many times it had become instinct. At 9:53 am, his MiG-21 lifts off the runway and climbs into formation exactly as briefed. For the first few minutes, everything is textbook, routine, forgettable, and then, several minutes into the flight, Redfa peels away from his assigned patrol route. He switches off his transponder, kills radio contact, and banks hard, south, toward Jordan, toward the border he has spent 3 years quietly preparing to cross, toward a country his government has trained him, since flight school, to see as the enemy. Back at his base, it doesn't take long for ground control to notice something's wrong. Redfa isn't answering hails. His transponder signal has vanished. Within minutes, Iraqi command realizes what's happening isn't a malfunction. It's a defection. In progress, in real time. Alarms ripple through the Iraqi Air Force chain of command. Interceptor jets are ordered scrambled to chase him down and force him back, or shoot him out of the sky before he can reach hostile territory. But Redfa has a head start, and he's flying one of the fastest aircraft in the region. Every second matters now. Every second closes the gap between him and the airspace that means safety, or opens the gap for an interceptor to catch him from behind. And it isn't just Iraqi jets he has to worry about. As Redfa crosses into Jordanian airspace, he is now flying, uninvited, over a second hostile nation, one whose own air defenses have no idea who he is, or why a Soviet-built fighter jet is screaming across their skies without clearance. For a few unbearable minutes, Redfa is a man with no allies in the sky at all. Any nation below him would be entirely justified, by the rules of the era, in shooting him down without warning. Then, the Israeli border comes into view, and with it, an entirely new danger, because Israeli air defense has no idea a defection is underway. All they see is an unmarked, high-speed military aircraft entering their airspace without authorization, the exact signature of an attack. Israeli interceptors are already airborne, fingers hover over weapons systems. In the confusion of those final minutes, the entire 3-year operation is suddenly one radio misunderstanding away from ending not in triumph, but in Israeli pilots shooting down the very prize they'd spent years trying to obtain. At the very last moment, coded communication, prearranged for this exact scenario, reaches the intercepting jets. Confirmation comes through. This is the asset. Do not engage. Escorted now rather than hunted, Redfa's MiG-21 is guided down onto an Israeli Air Force runway. His wheels touch tarmac, and in that single moment, Israel officially becomes the first Western-aligned nation to possess an intact, fully operational Soviet MiG-21 fighter jet. Operation Diamond is complete. What happened next changed the balance of air power for an entire generation. Israeli engineers and pilots spent months tearing the MiG-21 apart, piece by piece, studying its radar signature, its turning limits, its stall behavior, every strength and every weakness a Western military had never been able to observe firsthand. Just a year later, in June 1967, that knowledge would prove devastatingly relevant. When Israel launched preemptive airstrikes at the outset of the Six-Day War, its pilots weren't flying blind against Egyptian and Syrian MiG-21s the way they might have been. They understood the machine they were fighting, because they'd already flown one themselves. But the ripple didn't stop at Israel's borders. In an extraordinary act of intelligence sharing, Israel eventually allowed the United States military to study and test fly the captured aircraft as well. That access became critical groundwork for a secretive American program that would come to be known as Have Donut, the U.S. military's first real opportunity to fly and evaluate Soviet fighter technology under controlled conditions. The data gathered helped reshape American air combat training doctrine in the years that followed, contributing to programs designed to teach U.S. pilots how to fight and beat the exact jets they would soon face over the skies of Vietnam. A single stolen aircraft, flown out of Iraq by one disillusioned pilot, had quietly rippled all the way into another war on the other side of the planet. But for the man at the center of it all, victory came with a price that never really faded. Munir Redfa never returned to Iraq. He couldn't. In the eyes of his home government, he was, and would remain, a traitor, a man who had defected with state secrets and handed them directly to the enemy. Reports at the time suggested the Iraqi government considered him a marked man for the remainder of his life, a threat that shaped his every movement in exile. He and his family lived under new identities, moving between countries, never able to fully settle, never able to speak publicly about what they had done or why. The financial reward and the promise of safety Mossad had offered came through. but the ordinary, boring freedoms most of us take for granted, visiting old friends, walking familiar streets, being known by your own name, were gone forever. He had escaped one prison, in a sense, only to build the walls of another one around himself, quieter, safer, but permanent all the same. Today, that very aircraft, the jet that redirected the outcome of wars it never fought in, sits quietly in an Israeli Air Force museum. Most visitors who walk past it have no idea what it represents, no idea about the 3 years of patient manipulation, the failed attempts and lost agents, the family smuggled out one relative at a time, or the 11 most terrifying minutes of one man's life. It's easy, from a distance of 60 years, to file Operation Diamond away as a clean intelligence success story, a triumph of patience and psychological insight over brute force. And in a strictly operational sense, it was. But underneath the tradecraft and the technical triumph is a much harder question. What does it actually cost a human being to become a weapon in someone else's war? Munir Redfa believed, by every account, that he was doing the right thing, striking back against a government that had ordered him to bomb his own countrymen, refused to honor his service, and treated him as permanently less than the men beside him in the cockpit. Was he a traitor? Was he a hero? Was he simply a man who ran out of other options, in a system engineered to leave men like him with none? History rarely offers a clean answer to questions like that, and maybe it isn't supposed to. What we do know is this: an entire chapter of Cold War history, a chapter that quietly shaped the outcome of wars on multiple continents, came down to one man, one jet, and 11 minutes over the desert. So I'll leave you with the question this story keeps circling back to. Where do you draw the line between betrayal and survival? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this one, where a single decision by a single person quietly rewrote the course of history, hit subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.